Well, it's just gone to the top of the hour. There's still a few people joining in as usual, but we may as well get started. To all of our attendees today, thank you very much for joining us. I'm Nick Ashton-Hart, the Digital Trade Network's Geneva representative, and we're happy to host you for a discussion of the Telecommunications reference paper and the digital economy making the connection, which I realize today this is the second Making the Connection that we have done, a seminar with that in the title, and Sofie of the ITU has been a part of both of them. For those of you who are attending who did not see the last one, you'll be able to find the video to that related to the digital divide when the video for this session is sent around. We are recording today, just so that you all know. We are only recording the panelists and not the Q&A, so that during the Q&A people can feel free to ask whatever question and have a free exchange of views. And after the seminar, the presentations you see, the references to materials and the like will be circulated to everyone who registered for the session. And of course, you'll be able to view the video on YouTube. I'm very glad today that we are joined by, in no particular order, well, alphabetical order, I guess, Nathalia Foditsch, the Senior Policy Specialist for the Alliance for the Affordable Internet, Sofie Maddens, the Head of Regulatory and Market Environment Division at the ITU, and Gordon Moir, a partner at Wiggin LLP. That you'll hear a bit more about them in their discussions with you. But we may as well get a start with Gordon to give an overview of what the reference paper actually provides for or requires of the member states who implement it. So over to you, Gordon.
Thank you very much. Can you see my screen, everyone? Can you see the slides?
Yes, we can, Gordon.
Fantastic, thank you. So a very, very quick bit of background on myself. I've been heavily involved in these issues for about 20 years now. I was head of British Telecom's global regulatory and antitrust teams, and as well as being chair of the IIC Telecoms Committee, who spent a lot of time working on these kinds of issues for players around the world. So pleasure to be here. And just as you said, I've been asked to give a little bit of a headline on what does the reference paper do, what are the genus of it, and specifically what have been the challenges. So if I can just turn to the next slide. So just to contextualize, and again, apologies to those of you who live and breathe these topics, we have the GATS Telecom Annex and the Telecoms Reference Paper. The relationship between the two, I think, is actually best summarized in the panel report in the Mexico case, which is the only case which has really looked at these kinds of issues. And the summary there was the annex and the reference paper overlap, but there's clear differences. And just to summarize at a very high level, the reference paper was driven by a very clear appreciation that the specific market access obligations in the annex did not give enough detail and did not help address the substantive issues that were being faced by players in the telecom space, not least being able to effectively guarantee competition in the telecom sector. And from our experience in this area, working for carriers and for governments, it is absolutely right that to enable effective competition in telecoms, one requires a level of detail in the regulatory framework which goes beyond what the annex can cover. And that was why the reference paper evolved to specifically cover things like competitive safeguards, interconnection, and deal with very, very complicated but essential mechanisms to allow for competitive access to facilities on the ground. So the annex itself, very high level, around two themes. The first theme was transparency, so that each member allowed relevant information on conditions on access to third parties, including tariffs and terms and conditions. and then a very generic statement around each member ensuring that service suppliers of other member states get access to telecommunications, transport networks and services, obviously with the relevant caveats on network security, etc. So that's the annex, and as I said, very, very high level. Now it does apply to public telecommunications transport networks and services, so it carries that relatively wide definition, but again, it very much lacked the detail around what those obligations of transparency and access would require to be practically effective on the ground and to really deliver up these competitive frameworks. So the reference paper from 1996 therefore set out to develop on 6 key themes. The first one is on licensing, and frankly I think this is probably the one where it is weakest, because there's not really that much detail around what that would require, and that has caused substantial problems on the ground for players understanding effectively a massively divergent patchwork of different frameworks across the globe, even for those who've signed up to the reference paper. The second theme is on an independent regulator. So again, a strong, fair and efficient regulator, sufficiently resourced and with a job to implement laws and regulations and to act as a referee in resolving disputes. The third element was to provide for interconnection. Again, these critical dialogues between the different players to allow them access to each other's facilities to really deliver services for end users. The key one, and this came up in the Mexico case, as those of you who were involved will know, the reference paper critically built, for the first time, anti-competitive protections into a trade framework. So there's an obligation to prevent or address anti-competitive conduct by incumbents, and that includes things like cross subsidies, misuse of information. So if the incumbent gets access to the plans of a competitor, not to misuse that to then subvert competition. It goes into then define essential facilities, which are introduced in relation to major suppliers, and I'll come back to this in a second, and to try and prevent anti-competitive conduct by those suppliers in providing access to those facilities, particularly things like local access or local internet access services. And then finally, the right of states to define universal service obligations. That's what the reference paper does at a high level. And as you can appreciate, there's been quite a lot of dialogue around a number of things, particularly, as I mentioned, licensing, the ability of this framework, even though it has some detail, to try and harmonize better the regulatory frameworks across the world, which is important, particularly as we see more and more cross-border service provision. Most of my clients face hugely divergent rules in different jurisdictions. And then the other one, and I'm sure those of you who are heavily involved in this know, there's a lot of contention around the definitions of major suppliers, basic services, and that has led to very divergent application of the rules. So that's the reference paper. And then I won't talk about it too much because obviously we're now in the middle of these discussions, but there are some new proposals for the reference paper. A number of those include enlarging the scope to move away from this basic versus public network definition, and to try and enlarge the scope to cover all transmission and reception of signals. And that's to try and recognize the change in telecoms from the old circuit switched world into this very, very interconnected internet-based world of cloud and cross-border service provision that we all know today. To try and flesh out on the license and authorization regime, to try and build a more of a simple and more harmonized approach to licensing and authorization, again to help market entry, more clarity on independence of regulation, and a number of other pieces, including on essential facilities and an obligation to provide access on reasonable, transparent and non-discriminatory terms, and then backed up by the regulator's powers to enforce this. And then finally, and again, as a lawyer, one of the areas I think is most interesting is just trying to flesh out the dispute resolution provisions and what regulators should be able to do. And this is critical because in the end, a lot of these principles will stand or fail depending on the effectiveness of the dispute resolution procedure. If it takes 10 years for a carrier to run a national dispute to try and get access, it is too late, and effectively the regime will have failed. So the dispute resolution provisions and making sure that those are effective, transparent, and relatively rapid is critical. So that's really all I wanted to say at this stage, and then reopen back to the other speakers. I'm more than happy to take questions on that.
Thank you very much, Gordon. That was a very succinct but also really complete discussion of the basics here. Following that, we have Sofie Maddens at the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union. Go for it, Sofie.
Thanks so much, Nick, and good morning, good afternoon to everybody. My name is Sofie Maddens. I'm a Belgian lawyer by training. I'm the head of the Regulatory and Market Environment Division in the ITU. And on a personal note, this is actually bittersweet for me because the very first time I came to Geneva was in fact within the context of the WTO, where I was assisting certainly on Britain in the European Commission in the advisory and consultative committee on the European services sector. And I was expecting my son, who's now 25 years old. So just to place this in the time. So thanks so much, Nick, for bringing back these memories. And thank you, Gordon, for setting the stage for our discussions. I'm going to place this within the context of where we are today, because we are in this world, this fast-changing digital world. And as ICT telecom regulators, we do need to keep abreast of these new approaches, new tools, and we need to speed up and streamline regulatory processes and enhance collaboration, both domestically, but also regionally and internationally. So Gordon mentioned a number of these regulatory basic issues. And while these regulatory basics still apply, we do need to use the core regulatory mandates thoughtfully. And our mandates and our jobs require new skills and new thinking to create that enabling environment for digital transformation so that we can continue to attract investment, ensure access for all, and all of this in a safe, secure manner. It's also important to remember that this digital transformation, if we go back to the 1980s, 1990s, there was that realization that ICT telecoms was really at the basis of economic and social development. And today we're looking at this digital transformation, and all of us have gone through this last year where we've seen how digital is really at the core of our lives and how digital is supporting all sectors of the economy, changing societies, markets, countries, regions. It improves the access to and the delivery of services, but for that we need competitive market environments. And obviously with the opportunities, there are challenges. And so that collaboration between policymakers, between trade negotiators, policymakers, regulatory authorities, and other stakeholders is required both at national, regional, and international level. It's the way to make policy and regulatory action converge towards these social and economic goals, fast track our priorities, gain in efficiency, and let us say, help us lead our lives in this COVID era. Next slide, please. So during my presentation, I will touch upon the GATS framework, but also go into the economic impact of broadband digitization and ICT regulation, and focus on this concept of that collaborative regulation, nationally, regionally, globally, and really why it's important to connect the dots and why it's important to have those conversations and to insert the results of those conversations into any negotiations. So let's go back, next slide, please, to what Gordon talked to us about. So we're looking at these international and regional commitments. So going back to 1997, a core group of countries first concluded the negotiations liberalizing trade in telecoms by making commitments pursuant to GATS, a collection of commitments known as the Basic Telecommunications Agreement, which Gordon referred to. And that really showed that there were increased opportunities for trade and domestic investment in countries around the world. I would like to say, and having worked as a consultant since the 1990s in many, many countries, these commitments in communications, particularly basic telecommunications, it really benefited domestic sector reform agendas of countries, because by making such commitments, countries often created momentum for that domestic sector reform. And they anchored those reforms within an international legal framework to guard against policy reversal. I personally worked in some countries in the Middle East in 2003, 2005, and we had this commitment in front of us when we were discussing with the stakeholders, how do we move ahead in liberalizing the market and really updating the legal and regulatory framework to be in line with these commitments. So the commitments correlated with telecom sector investment, but also better performance in the telecommunication sector vis-a-vis neighboring countries with similar levels of economic developments. So it showed more rapid growth in fixed line penetration, mobile subscribers, and telecommunication sector revenues as compared to other neighbors. So it was possible and necessary to negotiate the reference paper in 1907. It was possible because at the time that governments from around the world were negotiating the agreement on basic telecommunications, we had already seen this wave of openings in the European Union, Japan, Canada, the United States, and other regions of the world, just as industry was rapidly expanding and transforming. And there was that political momentum towards telecommunication liberalization, and it made that market opening and regulatory reform possible. We also understood that to make market opening effective, we would need to commit to measures that would ensure, as Gordon said, that all market participants would have a fair chance to compete. And so the substantive elements of the reference paper included prevention of anti-competitive practices by major suppliers. It included guarantees of reasonable interconnection with major suppliers, transparent and competitively neutral universal service programs, that public availability of licensing criteria, the transparent and non-discriminatory procedures for the allocation of scarce resources such as spectrum and numbering. And overseeing all of this would be the task of what we call the independent regulators. Now, independent regulators, independent from operation is how it was defined. And let's not forget the major supplier in many, many of the countries was really a state-owned monopoly provider of both fixed and wireless. So there was that need for the independent, that regulatory body overseeing these disciplines to be separate from and not accountable to any supplier of basic telecommunications sector. So that I just wanted to set that framework. So if we go to the next slide, just a couple of thoughts here. So some thoughts. The Telecoms Act, the aim of the annex was to achieve that fair competition for effective market access for services. And the obligations applied to basic telecom service suppliers, although the benefits extended to all service suppliers as committed. The thrust of the main provisions of the reference paper, we've talked about it: competition, interconnection, independence, universal service, fair administration of finite resources, transparency of licensing. So there was that scope and there were these provisions there. Now, how was the reference paper received amongst members? Why was it really successful and what did it accomplish? It's because that anti-competitive behavior, widely recognized by governments, was seen to be an obstacle to realizing these telecom sector reforms. And telecoms was really starting to be seen and recognized as essential for economic and social development. The principles were really drawn from best practice because national telecoms authorities were really involved in the drafting. And the governments felt that it would help to really keep the reforms that they committed to on track. And regulatory authorities recognized that their work in a challenging transition environment would be supported. So, and many, many countries wanted to see that telecom reform. They were seeing the examples in front of them, and they were seeing these monopolies as some kind of barrier to economy and trade. And so the reform laws and regulators, often brand new and under-resourced, they faced even greater challenges to keep liberalization of telecoms on trade. So many were looking for a blueprint, a model, and that reference paper really served as a blueprint. There was some resistance from incumbent operators in particular, but the regulators, by having these commitments and having that regional wave, it really strengthened their hand. So where do we stand in terms of ICT development and regulation today? Next slide, please. So ICTs have really moved beyond just communications today. They've become the foundation for every economic sector, business performance, national, and dare I say, individual growth. So regulators and policymakers are really adjusting to ways to connect with their counterparts across the economic sectors, as well as practices of regulation interventions to leverage on that digital transformation as an engine for sustainable development. To really facilitate the transformation of industry and bring the advantages of ICTs to the end user, we need to focus on driving inclusive, cross-sectoral, and dare I say, international approaches and collaboration so that all players have their voice in decision-making and contribute to the success of others. Important too is that rules and decisions, oops, excuse me, I have some other, I have some other windows popping up. Important too is that rules and decisions should be based on current and granular evidence and market data, and that we have to continue to create that cycle, that dynamic for innovation, investment, and inclusion. So we need to have those tools, processes, and procedures so as to be able to engage the broad range of stakeholders in the collaborative regulatory approaches across sectors, across stakeholders, and indeed across countries and regions, so that we can get to that decision making. So what is regulation in the digital ecosystem? Next slide, please. If we see today's world, we really see accelerating technological development and digital transformation, and that has brought upheaval and change to us. Let's look at some of these changes. We have changes in business and investment models. We have changes in the financing of telecom and ICT infrastructure. We have changes in regulatory processes and changes in approaches to foster that innovative regulatory approaches. We have evolving and new concepts that aren't necessarily linked to just one country. We have concepts such as digital identity across a growing number of services, consumer protection, confidentiality, data protection. We have end-to-end process change, such as blockchain and AI across sectors like finance and health. So we're all users of digital services and experiencing change. And we're confronted in a global digital environment with new types of challenges, and these require new regulatory measures and tools. So are we all equipped with the necessary commitments, agreements, tools, process? These are some of the questions I think we need to address, and I'd love to follow up further in our discussions. So if we go to the next slide, the next slide is really to tell you why is it important. Next slide, Celia. By the end of 2019, 4 billion people, or a bit more than 50% of the global population was online, but many still remain unconnected. Next slide. So to connect the next billion, we need a huge amount of investment. If we look as the ultimate ambitious goal, the major infrastructure investment challenge is $428 billion that are required to connect the rest of humanity. Next slide. And why is it important? Because broadband, the economic impact of broadband digitization and ICT regulation cannot be underestimated. In 2009, the World Bank found that for every 10 percentage point increase in high-speed internet, there was an increase in economic growth of 1.3 percentage points. A recent ITU study on this economic contribution of broadband digitization and ICT regulation provides that additional evidence on the economic contribution of broadband and digital transformation to the economy, and also of legal and regulatory frameworks. And it's based on economic metric modeling. We found that a 10% increase in fixed broadband penetration yields an average increase of 0.8% in GDP. And investment is a strong catalyst of GDP growth, which suggests an important contribution on the economy. And the same goes for mobile. An increase of 10% in mobile broadband penetration yields an increase in 1.5% in GDP. But let's think of this way. The full economic impact of ICT is achieved through the cumulative adoption of all technologies, in addition to the assimilation and usage in the production and social fabric. So achieving broadband penetration is only one aspect of required policies. Maximization of economic impact can only be achieved through a holistic set of policies, ranging from internet access and adoption to computing to electronic commerce. So the next slide looks at some of these economic impacts and some of the measures and issues relating to that. Next slide, please. So now let's come to the importance of the regulatory and institutional variables in driving digital ecosystem growth. Let's remember the core principles: interconnection, competition, independent regulators. So we found that the connectivity of digital services is significantly correlated with the level of advancement of ICT policies and regulations, building on those core principles, and the competition and market power regulatory setup in particular. Investment in the digital ecosystem are directly and positively influenced by the maturity of ICT regulatory frameworks and ICT competition frameworks. Let's not forget the market access, the competitive framework. So all of these findings suggest that new policies and regulations need to be built into and onto existing ones in order to increase their relevance and impact on the development of the digital ecosystem. So next slide, please. So how has regulation evolved? Let's just look at the next slide to see from the last 20, 30 years. We talked about when the reference paper was negotiated. So we really still had these monopolies. We call them the first generation of regulation. So regulated public monopolies, command and control approach. And we've evolved over these last decades. It's been a roller coaster. I know Gordon and Nick will agree with me. It's been an absolute roller coaster as we've gone through these generations of regulation, where we started to liberalize, where we started to realize the economic and social impact. And now where we're seeing the 5th generation collaborative regulation, where really that collaboration across the sectors is being discussed and is being put in place. And also that inclusive dialogue and harmonized approach across the sector. As I said, it's been like a roller coaster. And why has regulation evolved at such a rapid pace? Because markets around the world. We often still say that regulation resists or struggles to keep up with markets and technologies, but we can't afford to keep catching up with markets. In many respects, we're expected to lead markets and ensure that long-term resilience and growth. So we've moved far beyond just trying to achieve competition and market access, and we really need to address these new challenges. In many industries, the trends driving the evolution of regulation over the past 2 decades have been rather similar. We've seen the state moving out of market operations and leave private sector initiative shape the market dynamics. So those independent regulators that we called for in the 90s, in most countries, they now exist to oversee the sector markets. We've also seen regulations evolving from obligation-based to incentive-based, and we've seen more inclusive decision-making processes and dispute resolution processes. Consumers have come into the center of regulators' attention, and data has really become the basis of policy and decision-making. So in looking at those frameworks of regulation, we reflect this evolution, going from a sector's perspective to more recently, holistically, looking at how governments have configured their legal and institutional frameworks for this digital transformation. In just over a decade, that 4th generation has become the established standard for ICT integrated regulation. And now we're looking at G5 as the next frontier in terms of holistic digital regulation. So what are the lessons learned towards digital transformation? On the next slide, we can see that. Stakeholders have a key role to play. We have to balance regulatory oversight versus stakeholder input. We have to really know our markets. We need to look on the impact of regulation on the economy and trade, maintain that transparency, think holistic. Bottom-up approaches do make it work. Let's not forget that regulators need that capacity to have impact. We need to share data and common principles across borders, across regions, and globally. And people are the key to successful collaboration. Together, we can create that culture of dialogue and achieve that collaborative regulation. So to finish off, as Nick said, we just wanted to illustrate some of the digital economy and regulation policy and tools where you can go and read up on some of these developments. So if we go 2 slides further, please, Celia. I just wanted to highlight 2 particular products that you can really go and look at. I think many of you have probably seen the Telecoms Gone into ICT Regulation Handbook. This year, we worked together with the World Bank to look at the Digital Regulation Handbook, a 20th anniversary edition, in which some of these principles are laid out and explained. It's now available in all official languages, and we would really encourage you to, if you have any questions, to look at that. Also, the generations of regulation and really the ICT regulatory tracker to see how some of the principles embedded in the reference paper and the annex have really been implemented in countries. Go ahead and look at our ICT regulatory tracker and our ICTI, because that really gives the data of what I was just describing to you. So with that, Nick, team, I'll leave it over to you, give it back to you. If we can go to the next slide, you can see our, the next slide, please. You can see our address of NITU, and please, regulation does matter. Thank you, Nick, back to you.
Thank you very much, Sofie. I think that's probably the slogan of this session, certainly. Well, thank you for that very much. And now over to you, Nathalia.
Thank you, Nick. Let me try to share my screen. Do you see it?
Yes, we do, Nathalia.
Okay. Well, good morning, good afternoon, evening, and thank you so much for the invitation. My name is Nathalia Foditsch. I am working for the Alliance for Affordable Internet, which is part of the World Wide Web Foundation. I actually started, what actually got me hooked into this topics of broadband and communication was actually competition law and policy, because when I was working for the Brazilian Competition Authority, I was working for the presidency's cabinet, and I got a case in which it was all about internet and broadband regulation, and I had no idea of like that whole that was 12 years ago, but or 11 or something. But that's some of these conversations I have been in touch since then, but it's so interesting to hear from colleagues that have the experience from the trade conversations, not just the competition conversations. And I'm learning a lot with the presentations of my colleagues. I will also like to add, since Sofie has mentioned some of the publications, we have recently had the opportunity to do a study for the ITU, which actually was shown in one of her slides, which is called Connecting Humanity. So I would encourage you to look to that one too. And yeah, I have some comments about what my colleagues have raised in their presentations, but maybe I will start mine. So the Alliance for Affordable Internet is the world's broadest technology sector alliance. We try to literally use all we have been debating here, and this we mainly use what we're discussing here, we use on a daily basis, because that's what we do. We try to make better, like we work with countries, and we work with multi-stakeholder coalitions in countries to drive better policies and regulatory frameworks. So all we are debating here has to do with our work. Um, so just to quickly provide some ideas of where we are, right? Like, despite the fact that we have been making a lot of progress over the past decades, especially over the past 5 years or so, we still have almost half the world that is not connected. And then now we are also we are realizing that, okay, it's important to understand who is connected and who is not connected, but also this binary division is not enough any longer. So we are also working on a concept called meaningful connectivity, which try to measure and establish targets for dimensions within the access concept, right? So the person should have this. We are establishing minimum targets to move out from this binary division. So the person should have at least a smartphone, should connect every day, not because the current standard from the United Nations is if you connect every 3 months, that already considers that you are connected. So we believe that you're only meaningfully connected if you connect every day. And also you should have a proper device, and you should have unlimited data or enough data to make sure that you fully take advantage of what the internet has to offer. We have seen so much now with COVID, online education. I was just reading some numbers about Brazil yesterday, and at a different event that I presented it, about 30% of students in the poor areas have not attended school for the whole 2020. So that's a real issue. So just going back to what I was saying, we also have been working for a few years now on the concept of 1 for 2 affordability target. And just quickly to go over it, well, first, a lot of countries first of all, what is this concept? It means that for 1 giga of data, you should spend maximum 2% of your average monthly income. Right now, I mean, we don't analyze the whole country or every single country, but out of 100 countries, only 40% are meeting the target. But even within the countries that are actually meeting this target, we still have disparities in income quintiles too. So here is just one quick example of a few countries. So we see here that while the upper 40% of the population is meeting this target in these countries, which I have brought as an example here, the bottom 60 or 40% pays so much more, right, for data, and it represents so much more of their average monthly income. So a few comments on what we have seen in various countries. While I was listening to my colleagues, I so many things made sense. For example, when Gordon was mentioning licensing, that is the weakest, we still see in various countries. I mean, I have worked mostly, I mean, now I work with Africa and Asia too, but my main experience is in Latin America. So I tend to bring examples from Latin America, from various countries across the region. And yes, we still see that the licensing frameworks in these countries vary. The level of depth, the quality, and actually the extent to which they are applied for real, and that they can actually and I mean, it also ties with dispute resolution that they were also raising, because if you don't have a proper license framework, or if you do have a, I mean, in some cases you do have a proper framework, but it's hard to enforce what is there and to actually, you know, make it work. In Brazil, we even have like an expression in which we say that some of the laws and regulations don't have no glue to them, right? That they don't stick, they don't stick. So when we say they don't stick, means that sometimes you do have a great framework, and again, that varies a lot across various regions, but even if you do have this framework, you need to make sure you have a whole system in place to enforce them and to make sure that, you know, it's working on different levels. So also, I think that it's important to recognize that since we work with various developing countries, they have different levels of development. So some of these commitments that we are talking about, in some cases, you should first make sure that you have a level of market competition and penetration. And then after that, you take action, right? Because otherwise, you might be preventing the humanity to be connected. If you impose some of these things too strictly from scratch, especially in countries that are not yet fully developed, it's a harder approach to have. So we see that we need a forward-looking approach, and we do need all the things we are debating here, but we should make sure that we are fostering development and connecting humanity, and not doing the opposite. So this constructive role is, we have seen, I mean, in our day, we have a best practices database that I would encourage you to look at. And a lot there we show that a lot of these interventions have actually promoted growth and externalities. And but again, it's always a balancing exercise, because in some cases, what the public interest is not necessarily applying them all too strictly, right? So just like quickly, 3 countries, Colombia, Malaysia, Ghana, there are some quick examples here. In all these countries, we see that first we need a multi-year and multi-pronged approach, right? So these changes, they take some time, and a lot of these countries that I brought as examples, I mean, changes have been implemented for a whole decade now, or more than that. And also they mostly think about both supply and demand. They are not just focused on one specific side. In Colombia, for example, for about like 13 years, they have been passing several infrastructure sharing regulations. For example, like in the case of the 4G tender, the awardees that didn't want to comply with the things that were imposed could even lose that were failing to comply to what was established could even lose their spectrum license. So in some cases, you need, when you have a certain level of competition, like they already do, it's good to establish this sort of things. They also are already fostering the infrastructure sharing that goes beyond the telecommunications industry, so with other industries. So electricity grids and poles and ducts, that's one of the things I think is crucial too. So across various years, they have implemented several things to foster infrastructure sharing. And this even led to real impacts on affordability. And so, for example, the price of mobile broadband fell 3.3% between 2012 and 2017. So we see that there is impact, and there is also more competition, and the penetration rate has also increased a lot, especially of 3G and 4G. Okay, so Malaysia. Malaysia is also about a multi-year planning initiative, which started, I mean, first, I think it's interesting to realize that in some of these countries, the changes we are debated, I mean, the document we are debated was like they go hand in hand with their development of their digital economies and regulatory frameworks, right? So the whole legal foundation of the country, Malaysia, comes from the 90s when this first document, the WTO document, was being discussed. So and they have been, especially since 2010 in Malaysia, established an initiative that was focused on supply and demand side. So public access initiatives, expansion of coverage of cell phone coverage, but also subsidies for access and devices, and infrastructure sharing too. So like mandatory access pricing more recently, like, so some of these things more advanced, they came after the country already had reached a level of development, as I was saying. So smaller ISPs now have a much better environment, right? Like to work on, and investors too. They made a lot of efforts to attract investments, and especially for last mile access, and also exempted the sales tax and import duty and water supply side interventions too. So, I mean, I will say that I know that that's one of the fiscal and taxation part is a little bit more controversial, but that's also super important, and we see in most, like nearly all developing countries. In Ghana, they had a monopoly, as it was also frequent in many countries. And not only that was monopoly was hindering development of fixed broadband, but also international connectivity. And then as soon as they managed to foster more competitors for international connectivity, then you started meeting the demand for capacity in the country. And it's again, I mean, I think I will love to hear more about my colleagues to understand to what extent we have truly moved from liberalization, or in some cases we're still, in the beginning this was all about liberalization, but now are we still talking about liberalization, or have we moved past that? So Ghana, we have seen real decrease in prices there, and international connectivity. I think that in many conversations, I mean, of course you see that debate, but that is a super prominent one that we should go further into, I believe. And then I think I talked too much already, but I'm looking forward to the debate. And these are my contact information. I will stop sharing my screen.
Well, thank you very much, Nathalia. We're gonna turn to questions shortly. I mean, before we do that, I should say, as I said in the chat, to any attendees who have a question, you can ask it in the Q&A tab. You can ask it anonymously if you feel like you would like to do that. That's perfectly fine. And you can also raise your hand to ask a question, and I will work my host magic to allow you to actually be seen and or at least heard, so you can ask your question out loud. A couple of the overriding things that I can see from this, which I'm not surprised by, is that the reference paper provisions were visionary at their for their time, really ahead of their time, considering only a handful of countries even had independent regulators at the time. And as we've heard, really the trade negotiators very thoughtfully used the reference paper as a forcing mechanism. And if any of you want to pipe up on this, please do. Really use it as a forcing mechanism where they had a telecom market that needed liberalizing, and they needed an external, a solid external argument to overcome domestic resistance from incumbents. And I've heard this before many times from countries who've said, we literally use this trade rule as a way to force the country to move in a direction we all we all knew we needed to move, but needed to overcome the political resistance of an often unitary supplier, which had sort of captured any existing regulatory processes. And so if we looking at it now, and please tell me if any of you disagree, the reference paper is really a flaw. Like, you would need these provisions, you would need other provisions, but these basic provisions would be an absolute prerequisite for a modern telecommunications market and for affordability. Because I did I did a study for the Commonwealth last year, and if you look at the ICT regulatory tracker from the ITU, and you look at the affordability results of A4AI's work on the average cost per person of broadband, it's clearly, there's a clearly very strong correlation between a high score on the regulatory index and lower costs for users, and lower performance on the regulatory index and higher cost for users. And I mean, Nathalia, you made that starkly clear, as did you, Sofie. We're not talking about a minor change in affordability. I mean, I was finding that least developed countries on average had more than 10 times as expensive cost, up to 10%, 11% of monthly income for a 1 gig connection. And that's like a house payment in a lot of the world. Well, your house payment's a little bit more, but you would expect it to be a little bit more. It's your house payment. Who's going to pay 10% of their monthly income for broadband? So, I mean, I bring up this floor, not a ceiling thing, because I know it's a real concern for negotiators that if they're going to make a commitment at the WTO, they're taking something off the table for good in national life. It's not something you can just change your mind about. Once you make a commitment, it's pretty much stuck there. But it seems to me here the policy space is a problem, actually. having the policy space to not have independent regulation and to not have universal service is actually a problem, not a benefit. You actually, closing this off actually gives you more opportunities. It doesn't take opportunities away, and I'm not sure that's always appreciated. But there are times when having policy space is the opposite of what you really need in terms of the future. So I don't know if any of you have any thoughts on those sort of major points while we wait for some hands to go up.
Nick, I'd be happy to jump in.
Yeah.
Indeed, having worked in multiple countries, I absolutely agree with you that it really was a forcing mechanism, and looking at forcing mechanism not only to liberalize the telecommunications market, but to get those discussions started on liberalizing the telecommunications market. And absolutely, looking at it now, if we look at the main provisions, competition, the abuse of dominance, absolutely, that's a basic element. But we need to think of it now, competition with major digital players. Do we need to readdress that? Do we need to rethink what we mean, that abuse of dominance how, dominance where, dominance with which market players? Then obviously an interconnection was a big issue, and it continues to be a big issue, that we have to guarantee that fairness. I think the need for independent regulators, yes, we have, and I don't have the number in my mind right now, but I can send it in the link later. So there are those independent regulators in most countries. Again, I hasten to say it's not just about creating the regulators, but also resourcing them with the human, technical, and financial skills so that they can actually really analyze the markets. And we're seeing many of these regulators going to what they call data-driven regulation now. There are new regulatory tools, there are new regulatory approaches. So we need to continue to resource our regulators so that they can really be ahead of that curve. The universal service as well, we're looking at universal services. And when we talk about universal service, it needs to be competition friendly is what the principle was. But looking at universal service, let's not look just as universal service as being solely about universal service funds. It's about how do we really make sure we achieve that universal connectivity that's affordable and useful, so that people have access and use, and what are the tools that we can use there, and what are some of the innovative financing mechanisms we can consider. So I think that's very interesting as well. Obviously, the fair administration of finite resources, spectrum, number, rights of way, still very much at the top of many regulators' agendas. And the rights of way, when I talk about collaborative regulation, that's where we have it staring in our face. Because when we talk about rights of way, we need to work together with other regulators and with other sectors so that we can ensure those rights of way. And obviously licensing, both Nathalia and Gordon mentioned licensing, the transparent criteria for licensing. I think we've come a far way, but we really still need to look at that licensing to make sure that we guarantee that fair market access. So I just wanted to respond to some of your points there.
Yeah, thanks very much, Sofie. Nathalia, I saw you nodding vigorously, and Gordon, you also seem to, if either of you have some thoughts on these things.
No, I think it's absolutely right. The reference paper is the bare minimum of the core principles that one should have in this environment. A number of people have mentioned, including the questions on other players, including Google and Amazon, etc. And I think there are areas where they may be swept up because they will be providing the kinds of telecoms or infrastructure services that we are talking about. But we need to be a little careful here that those areas are more complex. There's different policy objectives being driven at. So you're looking at things like online harms and issues around hate speech, etc., etc. I think there's a risk that we start to conflate different regulatory issues, and I think there is definitely scope to look at broadening out the existing framework and the reference paper and communications regulation. And I think one area of that, for example, is number independent communications, so the WhatsApps, etc. We see these services starting expand. And there's definitely scope to pick up these within the reference paper. One plea I would make going forward, though, is about the regulators and this data-driven piece, is that more and more transparency on regulatory decisions, so that we can see that the trade-offs that are being made by regulators between different policy decisions, whether it's universal service, whether it's regulation of new players, because there needs to be, this is a really critical stage now, we need to understand exactly what the regulators are doing so that everyone has a clear picture as to what is being regulated and why. And that is a really important one. So the transparency piece of the reference paper, for me, as we start to see these new players coming in and new services, is really, really important. So all players have an opportunity to understand what is being done to them or actions that could impact on them more widely.
Nathalia, any thoughts from you, from the vigorous nodding?
Well, I was even taking notes too. I think it's definitely a challenge, because I think that in some cases these new players, technology companies, it's not only about it's about how they if and how they adapt, or if they are subject to this. But in some cases, they are actually doing pretty services and projects that are pretty much what it was intended. This, what in the 90s people were intending to talk about, right? So I think it's a main challenge, and I don't think anyone has a clear answer, especially because it's not one specific problems, and it's not one specific we will never reach a consensus on this, because it depends on what exactly we're talking about, right? We're talking about access provision in the last mile when tech companies make deals with operators. Are we talking about there are so many layers to this conversation. And yeah, I think that one of the things that Sofie mentioned that will be crucial, and to be honest, I don't really see it's pretty worrying, is that the regulators were still first catching up to understand where we are at right now in terms of all these debates and data. And now it seems that, they in some cases they're starting to get a full grasp of what's going on in terms of like digital connectivity and everything. And then finally, now there are further challenges related to data and what would that mean for their analysis on their daily basis. And I think that's crucial, and I'm pretty maybe I shouldn't say worried, but I think that's a focal point for this debate. The resources and the technical resources for regulators to face these challenges that we are seeing right now, and we will see even further within the next years.
So this is an interesting dimension to this, and both you and Sofie have mentioned that is really countries should be seeking to already be done with the basics that the reference paper represents, because until you have a foundation for the house, you can't build the rest of the house. And the rest of the house now involves several steps beyond the basics of the reference paper in order to have a healthy telecom market now. Countries that don't have affordable connections and that don't have a high percentage of their citizens connected now are really behind in fundamental ways, and need to catch up actually and go further than what the reference paper provides for. And it's an interesting idea. If I know there's interest amongst JSI participants in how do we close the digital divide, and what can this negotiation contribute to doing that. and it'll be interesting to see what technical assistance and capacity building will be available to members once the agreement is concluded, depending on what it contains, that would help them actually move beyond the basics to catch up. I know we have because I know them. I know we have a few regulators actually as attendees. I won't call on you. I've sent a message to a couple, but you're very welcome to pipe up. Tillman Kupfer of BT is participating, and of course, BT, then British Telecom, were in a market that was one of the very first in the world to liberalize. I remember living in the UK, and in the late 80s, it still took some months. If you moved into a new apartment, it took some months to actually get a landline. At the time, of course, now you do it in a matter of minutes. You get a mobile phone or a landline, and you get your number. But I remember the good old days when it was not that, when the market was still unliberalized. Tillman, you've asked a question in the chat. Do you want me to promote you so you can ask your question auditorially, or